Alistair Campbell testified last week on the Iraq War. During the hearing, he denied beefing up the intelligence dossier that said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. It's 4 hours, 20 minutes.
Well, good morning, everyone. When we announced this first round of public hearings, we said that the first 5 weeks would be dedicated to establishing a chronology of the UK's involvement in Iraq between 2001 and 2009, and we've almost completed that phase. And today we're moving on to hear from ministers and the most senior decision makers over the next 4 weeks. We will then take a break over the period of the general election before resuming public hearings in the summer. We have yet to decide which witnesses we'll be calling back at that point. And these forthcoming sessions will not be the only opportunity to hear from them. And our approach in this phase is going to be to build on what we've already heard, to seek further information, clarify points, and explore different perspectives. The committee has yet to conclude what its formal lines of inquiry will be. Today, our witness is Alistair Campbell. You were Director of Communications and Strategy to the Prime Minister, including from the start of our period 2001, though it goes back long before, until August 2003. The objectives of today's session will be to cover some of the key meetings on UK policy development that Mr. Campbell was involved in as a close advisor to the Prime Minister, the presentation of the case for military action, including the drafting of the 2 dossiers of September 02 and February 03, and the presentational concerns surrounding the preparations for military action and its aftermath. Now, much of this is familiar ground that's already been examined by the work of Lord Hutton and the Butler Committee, as well as various parliamentary committees. Many of the relevant documents are already in the public domain, so we shall not be declassifying further documents today. We hope to be finished by lunchtime, but there's a lot of ground to cover. Now, I say this at every hearing. We recognise that witnesses are giving evidence based on their recollection of events, and we, of course, check what we hear against the papers to which we have access. I remind every witness that they will later be asked to sign a transcript of their evidence to the effect that the evidence they've given is truthful, fair, and accurate. And with that, we'll begin the questioning. Sir Roderick.
Mr. Campbell, good morning. You worked for Mr. Blair from 1994 until you announced your resignation on the 29th of August 2003. Did that make you, by 2003, the longest serving of his close advisors?
No. I'm trying to remember when Jonathan Powell arrived. I think he was just after me. There were certainly people in Downing Street who'd been around before I joined Tony Blair's team.
But effectively, on the team, you and Jonathan Powell were 2 very long-serving advisors. Now, in the period 2001 to 2003, which we're looking at this morning, you, as the chairman has said, were the Prime Minister's Director of Communications and Strategy. That's a very broad job description. What was your actual role?
How I would define it is that my job was to work with the Prime Minister in particular, but also other ministers and officials, to help devise and implement communication strategies for the government and the Prime Minister, both in relation to overall direction and objectives, and also in relation to specific issues as they arose. That's how I would define my job.
But just communication strategies?
Political strategies. I would say that in relation to the communications and strategy bit, it's the communications that I understood, but I think the longer I was with him, the more I think he developed a deeper understanding, and so did I, of the importance of strategic communications in terms of as really being the only way of dealing with the media as it was changing at a pace that frankly was faster than any of us could have predicted. So I think it was, I would say that was the essence of my job, was to...
But you weren't just dealing with communications and the media. I mean, the word strategy can embrace anything.
It can, yeah.
I mean, you said in your diary that you weren't a traditional communications director. You have said that you basically were there to do whatever the Prime Minister asked you to do. Would that be accurate?
Look, if he asked me to jump off a building, I wouldn't have done it. If he asked me to
Being
do
serious?
No, if he asked me to do anything that I thought to be silly or improper, I wouldn't do it. But he never did. And what's more, I think that it's really important to set a context for this in terms of when I talked earlier about the changing nature of the media. It has had a significant impact upon policy making, upon government institutions. And I guess my job was to try to advise him and also other ministers and colleagues in government through some of the tricky currents that threw up. But, yeah.
I mean, in your diary on the 7th of April 2002, you wrote of yourself and Jonathan Powell, what we did was largely driven by what TB wanted us to do and what our personalities best allowed us to do. So that's pretty broad. How close would you say your relations were with the Prime Minister?
Very. But I think that you know the Prime Minister, and he's somebody who understood that the job of leadership that he had, he could not do it alone. He was dependent upon political colleagues, some of whom he would be personally very close to, others that he wouldn't, but all of whom would be giving him something by nature of the job that he was trying to do.
Let's go into that in a bit more detail. I mean, you've talked of yourself, you've talked of Jonathan Powell. Who, apart from the two of you, would you have said constituted the circle of the Prime Minister's closest policy advisors in the period we're talking about?
I would put, in terms of policy advice, I would put ahead of Jonathan and me, David Manning, by a long way.
Did he spend more time with the Prime Minister than you and Jonathan?
I don't know. I didn't have a clock watch on it, but I would certainly say that in terms of, I mean, you'll be able to ask Tony Blair this when he comes to the inquiry, but David Manning was, I mean, I could not speak highly enough of the support that he gave to the Prime Minister. Okay, so David Manning. Certainly myself and Jonathan, we would probably see the Prime Minister first thing every morning. We'd probably see him last thing at night, and we'd see him plenty of times in between. I would say then, in relation, David Manning's team were important. In the context of the structure of meetings as they developed over time, I would say that John Scarlett was important. I'd say that Richard Dearlove was important. I would say that in this particular context, Jack Straw and Jeff Hoon, he probably would have been seeing as often as any other ministers, possibly with the exception of John Prescott and at different times Gordon Brown. And then the team around, beyond that, Sally Morgan was very, very important in relation to the Prime Minister's relations with the political system and the Parliamentary Labour Party and so forth. So he would, but he's somebody who would, when I sometimes talk about his decision-making style, he had this, what I used to call the circular conversation, where he's just talking to different people over a time frame and absorbing different thoughts and influences. And in terms of policy making, I've never been a policy person, never claimed to be a policy person. But I would be his person who was always thinking...
Just on that last point, I mean, you told the Foreign Affairs Committee, I quote, I was involved in a lot of the discussions about policy and strategy on Iraq.
Well, I was.
And I'm there as an advisor to the Prime Minister. So surely you were a policy person.
Yes, but I'm there as the part of that, if you like, the part of that discussion and that operation that is thinking the whole time about communications issues.